Hey friends, it's noon, and it's time to read the Bible again. We started with Deuteronomy and did that, and now we're in Joshua. We're in chapter 11. I should look ahead. 11 and 12 are both normal length. We've had some long ones that threw us over, but this is about an hour usually. We've had some shorter, some longer. We do a chapter of the King James Version, and then we read over John Wesley's notes on those, and then sometimes I find it necessary to connect some dots or give a little sermonette, which I'm going to stop feeling guilty about because I think it's my prerogative as a pastor, and who watches a pastor without expecting some kind of encouragement or message of understanding. So anyway, we'll go ahead and dive in. We're in chapter 11 of Joshua, and may the Holy Spirit guide us in our interpretation at this time, and may He open your heart and my heart to receive the word this day. All right. And it came to pass when Jabin, king of Hazor, had heard these things, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Achshaph, and to the kings that were on the north of the mountains and of the plains south of Chinneroth, and in the valley and in the borders of Dor on the west, and to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and to the Amorite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Jebusite in the mountains, and to the Hivite under Hermon in the land of Mizpeh. And they went out, and all their hosts with them, much people, even as the sand that is upon the seashore in the multitude, with horses and chariots very many. And when all the kings were met together, they came and pitched together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And the Lord said unto Joshua, Be not afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time will I deliver them up all slain before Israel. For thou shalt hough their horses, H-O-U-G-H, their horses, and burn their chariots with fire. So Joshua came, and all the people of war with him, against them by the waters of Merom suddenly, and they fell upon them. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who smote them and chased them unto great Zidon, and unto Misrephoth-Naim, and unto the valley of Mizpeh eastward, and they smote them until they left them none remaining. And Joshua did unto them as the Lord bade them. He houghed their horses and burnt their chariots with fire. And Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor, and smote the king thereof with the sword, for Hazor before time was head of all those kingdoms. And they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe, and he burnt Hazor with fire. And all the cities of those kings, and all the kings of them, did Joshua take, and smote them with the edge of the sword, and he utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord commanded. But as for the cities that stood still in their strength, Israel burned none of them, save Hazor only, that did Joshua burn. And all the spoil of these cities, and the cattle, and the children of Israel took for a prey unto themselves, but every man they smote with the edge of the sword, until they had destroyed them, neither left they any to breathe. As the Lord commanded Moses his servant, so did Moses command Joshua, and so did Joshua. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord commanded Moses. So Joshua took all that land, the hills and all the south country, and all the land of Goshen, and the valley and the plain and the mountain of Israel, and the valley of the same. Terry, good for you. You're back with us again. You're getting a lot of the word lately, lady. Good for you. God bless you. I think we're in verse 17. Even from the Mount Halak that goeth up to Seir, even unto Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon under Mount Hermon, and all their kings he took and smote them and slew them. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All other they took in battle. For it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might destroy them utterly, and that they might have no favor, but that he might destroy them, as the Lord commanded Moses. And at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod there remained. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land rested from war. Thus ends chapter 11. All right, I let my daughter play on my tablet while she was here with me in the morning, and that means it got down to 15%. Hopefully it maintains here. All right, we're in chapter 11. I got 17% battery. All right, the way that this gets broken down by Mr. Wesley is the opening section is the confederacy of many kings against Israel in verses 1 through 5. God's encouragement to Joshua and his conquest of them and their cities in verses 6 through 20. Then the destruction of the Anakim in verse 21 through 23. In verse 1, it talks about Hazor, quote, and it came to pass when Jabin, king of Hazor, had heard those things. Hazor was the chief city of those parts, as stated in verse 10, quote, and Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword, for Hazor before time was the head of all those kingdoms. Good catch. All right. Said he did this when he had heard these things, or those things. This was a remarkable instance of the wisdom and goodness of divine providence, which so governed the minds of the Canaanites, that they were not all united under one king, but divided amongst many petty kings. And next, that these did not all unanimously join their counsels and forces together to oppose the Israelites at their first entrance, but quietly suffered the destruction of their brethren, thereby preparing the way for their own. The notion here being that even though they did band together, they didn't band together so much that the armies of Israel were seriously threatened. That's not really a road we need to go down too much, because theologically it's very clear throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament that no matter how many people are on the opposite side, there is no winning against the Lord and his people. That just is how it is. So it seems providential to JW that even though kings did come together, the nature of their confederacies was always small. On verse 2, there's a phrase, on the north, quote, and to the kings that were on the north of the mountains and of the plains south of Chinneroth. The general designation of all the particular places following is that they were in the northern parts of Canaan, as those mentioned in chapter 10, verses 1 through 43. So I didn't finish the sentence. As those in chapter 10, verses 1 through 43 were in the southern parts, in the mountain, either in or near the mountain of Lebanon, called the mountain by way of eminency, or in the mountainous country. So in the previous chapter, chapter 10, the Israelites defeated all the powers in the southern region of the promised land, Canaan. Now, there's a confederacy of kings in the northern regions who's going to pick a fight with Israel, and Israel replicates its victories in the south, in the north. When it talks about Chinneroth in verse 2, and in the plains south of Chinneroth, and in the west valley, and in the borders of Dor on the west. In Hebrew, in the plain lying southward from Chinneroth, or the lake of Gennesareth. And then when it talks about Dor, that's a place upon the coast of the Midland Sea. In verse 3, it talks about the Canaanite, quote, and to the Canaanite on the east and on the west, and to the Amorite, and to the Hittite, etc. The Canaanites, properly so called, lived, part of them on the east near Jordan, and part on the west near the sea, and both are here united. It talks about the Hivite. They dwelt under Mount Hermon in the north of Canaan, whereby they are differenced from the Hivites who lived in Gibeon. When it talks about Mizpeh in verse 3, that is the Mizpeh which was in the northern part of Gilead. But there are other cities called by that name, which signifying a watching place might be easily applied to several places of good prospect. So Mizpeh in Hebrew means watch place, and so there would probably be many places that are a good watch place, and they name it that. So in verse 5, it makes reference to Merom, quote, and when all the kings were met together, they came and pitched together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. That's a lake made by the river Jordan in the northern part of it, which was in the territory of King Shimron, near Hazor, Jabin's royal city, and also in the middle of these confederate kings. Okay, so they came together in a central place to fight against Israel. When it talks about hoffing their horses, yeah, now I'm on this, I can look that word up. Wikipedia says hamstringing or severing the Achilles tendon of an animal. They didn't do that. Hamstringing just means tying them up so that they can't move. Yeah, that's about it. Okay, so when it says the Lord is talking to Joshua, he's saying, you will huff their horses. I should make sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. It doesn't have a pronunciation for me. No definition found. Yeah, I don't know. Let's say huff. Yeah, let's say huff so that it doesn't sound like they're huffing horses. Here it says, cut their hamstrings that they may be unfit for war. For God forbade them to keep many horses, now especially, that they might not trust to their horses, nor ascribe the conquest of the land to their own strength, the horses' own strength, but wholly to God, by whose power alone a company of raw and unexperienced footmen, that's the Hebrews, were able to subdue so potent a people who, besides their great numbers and giants and walled cities, had the advantage of many thousands of horses and chariots. So in case it sounds like this is like a normal invasion of a foreign force into a native population, the thing is the native population has several military advantages that mean nothing in God's sight. So he lists them off here. He doesn't say, well, wait, it says they're a potent people. That means powerful. They had great numbers. They had giants. That's the Anakim. And then they had walled cities. And then they had horses. These are 5 benefits that the Hebrews didn't have. The Hebrews, instead of taking their horses, one of the comparisons you can make. So world history is rife with populations invading each other. But I don't know about all those. I know about North America. Prior to the invasion of the West into North America, there were no horses here. That was part of the Columbian Exchange. So one of the things that happened was Native Americans got a hold of horses and they would steal horses and then they would breed horses. And then eventually that's how they traveled across the plains, and they did amazing warfare. They had great Native American warriors that got great on horseback. But even so, that military advantage wasn't enough to make them victorious. Here, if the Hebrews got horses, then they could start trusting in their own strength. The whole point here is they're supposed to trust in God's strength. But the horse is a great military advantage. But here, the Lord is saying, you're just going to chop them up. These horses aren't going to count for anything. In verse 7, it says, the Israelites descended suddenly. Yeah, Joshua ascended from Gilgal, and he and all the people of war with him No, that was chapter 10. So wait, we're in verse 7. So Joshua came and all the people of war with him against them by the waters of Merom suddenly, and they fell upon them. So they apparently had the element of surprise. They came when they least expected them, intending there to refresh and prepare and order themselves for the offensive war, which they designed. So they weren't arrayed for battle yet. They had gotten together to do battle, but even so, they weren't ready whenever the Israelites descended upon them. In verse 8, it talks about great Zidon, quote, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who smote them and chased them unto great Zidon, and unto Misrephoth-maim. Great Zidon is a great city in the northwest part of Canaan upon the sea. Misrephoth-maim, a place not far from Zidon, supposed to be so called from the salt or glass which they made there. I thought Mayim was water. So I don't know. Verse 8, then it talks about, and unto the valley of Mizpah eastward. So Mizpah, the valley of Mizpah, is under Mount Hermon, as appears by comparing this with verse 3 and 17, where it seems to be called the valley of Lebanon. So there's the valley of Mizpah, the valley of Lebanon. They seem to be one and the same. So this lay on the east as Zidon did on the west, and so it seems they fled several ways, and the Israelites also divided themselves into two bodies, one pursuing east and the other west. So this is in many ways very similar to the chapter before. In verse 10, it talks about the king, quote, and Joshua at that time turned back and took Hazor and smote the king thereof with the sword, for Hazor before time was the head of those kingdoms. JW says, in his royal city to which he fled out of battle. When it says he was the head of these kingdoms, it doesn't mean all of Canaan, but of all those who were confederate with him in this particular expedition. He was the head of those. In verse 11, there's the phrase, not any left, quote, and they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe, and he burnt Hazor with fire. Here JW makes clear no human person was left alive, but they were able to take animals this time. So as I said in the beginning, well, actually I think we covered this in Deuteronomy, but there's such a thing as a holy ban. The Hebrew word is harem. That's when the Lord mandates that they kill everyone, not just the men of war, but they kill everyone. Sometimes the Lord also requires that they kill all the animals, and sometimes the Lord requires that they destroy everything. They burn everything. There's nothing but a wasteland. They can't take anything to themselves. In each military battle, there are different expectations the Lord makes known. Sometimes explicit about that. Sometimes it just says what they did, and one's assumption is the Lord stipulated that they would do that way. In verse 13, there's the phrase, in their strength, quote, but as for the cities that stood still in their strength, Israel burned none of them, save Hazor only. That did Joshua burn. In Hebrew, with their fence, walls, or bulwarks, that is, which were not ruined with their walls in taking them. But as for the cities that stood still in their strength, the phrase in their strength in Hebrew means with their fence or walls or bulwarks. So the ones that were walled, that didn't mess with Israel, Israel didn't mess with them. Except Hazor, because this city began the war, and being the chief and royal city might renew the war, if the Canaanites should ever seize upon it, which in fact they did, and settled there under a king of the same name in Judges chapter 4, verse 2. How interesting. His name was Jabin, right? Yeah, Jabin, king of Hazor. That was in verse 1. All right. The phrase, all that land, in verse 16. So Joshua took all that land, the hills and all the south country, and all the land of Goshen, and the valley and the plain and the mountain of Israel, and the valley of the same. Here, all that land means of Canaan, whose parts here follow. The hill, or the mountain, that is the mountainous country, namely of Judea. A considerable part of Judea was called the hilly or the mountainous country. Not not just in the Old Testament, but also in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verses 39 and 65. It also talks about the south country, that is not only the mountainous part, but all the country of Judea, which lay in the southern part of Canaan, and often comes under the name of the south. When it talks about the vale, V-A-L-E, don't be thinking of Game of Thrones. It's talking about the low countries. When it's talking about the plain, that's talking about the fields or campaign grounds. And then when it talks about the mountain of Israel, that's the mountains or mountainous country of Israel. So there's the hilly or mountainous country, and whatever. I don't know. I can never tell how much he actually knows and then how much he's just trying to make sense of the words in his own mind. So someday I just need to take a course on ancient Israel topography and geography. In verse 17, it talks about Seir, even from the Mount Halak that goeth up to Seir, even unto Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon under Mount Hermon. And all their kings he took and smote them and slew them. So this is extending the areas that they took. So when it says to Seir, that is to the country of Seir or Edom, namely that part of it which was south from Judea, not that which was eastward from it, as appears from hence. That here is mention of the two extreme bounds of the land conquered by Joshua, whereof the other which follows being in the north, this must needs be in the south of the land. And then when it talks about Baal-Gad, that's just a part of Mount Lebanon. In verse 18, it talks about a long time. Quote, Joshua made war a long time with all those kings. J.W. says, for diverse years together, as is evident by the following history. And this is here expressed, lest it should be thought that as all these wars are here recorded in a short narration, so they were dispatched in a short time, and God would have the land to be conquered gradually for many weighty reasons. So this is something that was already stated in Deuteronomy, that God didn't want them to have just huge victories all at once, to get all the land at once. And then there are 5 reasons here that J.W. Lines out as to why he didn't want them to win just immediately all the battles. So this is all described in one chapter. However, it takes a long time, months, years, I don't know, probably years. I'm thinking it's probably years for them to do this. Here are the reasons. 1, lest the sudden extirpation of those nations should have made a great part of the land desert, and thereby have increased the number of wild beasts. All right, and that was the concern raised in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 22. The second reason, lest being done suddenly and easily, it should soon be forgotten and despised, as the nature of man is apt to do in these cases. So the notion being that if it went really fast, people would just take it for granted and not be very appreciative. But if you work long and hard for something, then you're going to appreciate the Lord more for it, for having seen you through. 3, that by long exercise the Israelites might grow skillful in the art of war. Something that occurred to me as I was reflecting yesterday was, so there's this ancient understanding of different races of humanity, different races of men, having different skills or attributes. The notion seems to be in the Old Testament, or one might carry this assumption through it rather comfortably, that the Lord is training, conditioning, making more fit the Hebrew people. They emerged from Egypt, an idol-worshiping, weak, ragtag, unfaithful group of poor slaves. That's essentially what they were. And then God is building them into a faithful, disciplined nation that is going to have the integrity and strength to save the rest of the world. That was always God's purpose with the chosen people, Israel. So in order for them to be reformed in that way, God is now training them. And he's training them in many ways. He's training them in obedience, because every time they fall short, he kills so many of them. So you have this natural selection thing where the only ones who survive are the ones who are obedient. And then you have, training in war, which from battle to battle they're getting better at. They're learning and honing their skills. All right, the fourth reason, why it couldn't go too quickly is for the trial and exercise of their patience and courage and trust in God. So that ties into the same thing where the Lord is training them. And the third point was training them in war, but fourth is training them in patience and courage and trust in God. And the fifth and final reason he gives is to oblige them to the greater care to please God, whom they yet need for their help against their enemies. Oblige means obligate them to the greater care to please God. For some reason, stringing this out over a prolonged period of time would help them to be primarily concerned with pleasing God longer. Yeah, and that kind of makes sense, because when the wars are over, then you just get your land, and then you're thinking about, okay, what would please me? What do I want to do? But here in battle, you're wanting to get to that final place, and so you're just thinking, what do I got to do to please the Lord? What do I need to do to get him to help us be successful in battle? I think that's what he's saying. In verse 19, there's the phrase, all other. Quote, there was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel, save the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All other they took in battle. Namely, all that were taken by Joshua were taken by the sword, and therefore it is no wonder that the war was long when the enemy was so obstinate. Okay. Verse 20 talks about hardening the hearts of the locals. Quote, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might destroy them utterly, and that they might have no favor, but that he might destroy them, as the Lord commanded Moses. JW says, it was the design of God's providence not to soften their hearts to a compliance with the Israelites, but to give them up to their own animosity, pride, confidence, and stubbornness, that so their abominable and incorrigible wickedness might be punished, and that the Israelites might not be mixed with them, but be entire among themselves in the possession of the land. One second. That was bothering me. Okay, so the notion, John Wesley was an Arminian. Most Methodists, the vast majority of Methodists are Arminians as well, which means that theologically there is not room for understanding God to use his power over an individual to condemn themselves. So when it says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart in Egypt, when it says that God hardens their hearts in Canaan, the notion is that it's just unacceptable for God to damn people, to make people do the things that they're damned for, to take away their free will and make them be the bad guy. Theologically, ethically, that's problematic for Arminians. So what JW here says is he didn't harden their hearts, it's that he let them be who they were, and he didn't soften their hearts the way he might do some. I think that might be splitting hairs theologically. The longer I walk in this tradition, the less that makes sense to me, especially if you're going to use phrases like the plain meaning of Scripture. The notion here seems to be that God, in order to glorify himself, desires that all the inhabitants of the land be wiped out. If they were allowed to repent and get right with God, then God would no longer be justified in killing them. So God hardens their hearts so as to make them worthy of the condemnation that they then experience. That just makes more sense, I think. I don't know. Y'all can argue with me. Verse 21, there's a phrase, at that time, quote, and at that time came Joshua and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, and from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua destroyed them utterly with their cities. So when it says at that time, it means in that war, but in diverse years. When it says they were in the mountain, it means, or mountains plural, the singular number for the plural. These barbarous and monstrous persons either chose to live in dens or caves, which were frequent in the mountains of those parts, or else they were driven thither by the arms and success of the Israelites. We'll see if he says giants anywhere, but the Anakim were known to be giants. When it says they were chased from Debir, That's from the territories belonging to these cities, as we have often seen in this history, cities mentioned for the country subject to them. When it talks about the mountains of Israel, it doth not follow from hence that this book was written by some other person long after Joshua's death, even after the division of the Israelites into two kingdoms of Israel and Judah, but only that this was one of those clauses which were added by Ezra or some other prophet, though that be not necessary, for since it was evident to Joshua from Genesis 44, I think, verse 10, that the tribe of Judah was to be the chief of all these tribes, and some dawnings of its eminency appeared in that time in their having the first lot in the land of Canaan. That's in chapter 15, verse 1, here in a bit. And the largest inheritance, it says in chapter 19, verse 9, it is no wonder that it is mentioned apart and distinguished from the rest of the tribes of Israel, though that also be one of them. But how could Joshua utterly destroy these when Caleb and Othniel destroyed some of them after Joshua's death? That's in chapter 14, verse 12, and Judges chapter 1, verses 10 through 12. So it's saying that he destroyed all the Anakim in this given area that's in Judah, but then later it reports that some of the Anakim are still there. So how does this happen? One, because these places, being in part destroyed and neglected by the Israelites, were repossessed by the giants. Yeah, there's giants. And by them kept till Caleb destroyed them. Or rather, because this work, though done by the particular valor of Caleb, is ascribed to Joshua as the general of the army, according to the manner of all historians. And therefore it is here attributed to Joshua, though afterwards, that Caleb might not lose his deserved honor, the history is more particularly described and Caleb owned as the greater instrument of it. The third explanation that can be offered, JW doesn't offer it, but it's in the video that I recommended from the Bible Project. They say that one of the features of Hebrew is that it often uses more extreme language than is factually accurate. That when Jesus says, for example, no one can follow me unless they learn to hate their father, mother, sister, brother, that's not what he actually means. That the Hebrew way of speaking exaggerates. The notion when the language of hate and love is used is that there needs to be a priority of relationships, that your relationship with God is primary. Now, likewise, what they say in the Bible Project video is they didn't actually kill every single individual constituent of a given area, but there were some left over. The point being that the language just shows how much they had their butt kicked, but there were ones remaining afterwards. Now, the first scenario, other reason that JW says is they could have come. It does say that they were left on the coast of the Mediterranean in 3 cities, later associated with the the Philistines. But so hypothetically, they could have come back over and resettled the land after the previous ones were killed. That's hypothetically possible. The second one is that the historians were just sloppy and they gave credit to Joshua, whereas it belonged to Caleb. All 3 are possible. And then verse 23, there's the phrase, the whole land. Quote, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord said unto Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance unto Israel according to the divisions by their tribes, and the land rested from war. When it says they took the whole land, that is the greatest and best part of it, for some parts are expressly accepted in the following history. Yeah, we're going to learn later they don't retake all of the land, actually. When it says that Joshua did all that the Lord said unto Moses, JW says God had promised to drive out all nations before them, and now the promise was fulfilled. Our successes and enjoyments are then doubly comfortable when we see them flowing to us from the promise. That is according to what the Lord hath said. Our obedience is acceptable when it has an eye to the precept. And if we make a conscience of our duty, we need not question the performance of the promise. That feels like it's supposed to be profound. It's not hitting me yet. Our successes and enjoyments are then doubly comfortable when we see them flowing to us from the promise. This is according to what the Lord hath said. Our obedience is acceptable when it has an eye to the precept. And if we make a conscience of our duty, we need not question the performance of the promise. I think what it's saying is God has made certain promises to us in his covenant with us that we can count on and then gladly and happily obey. So there are things that we can anticipate from our covenant with God that we know he is going to perform. So then that allows us to take more joy in doing our part, and it allows us to trust more fully that God is going to take care of our needs in the right time. I think that's what he's saying. If he's saying something else, I am too stupid to grasp it at this time. All right, we're going to do one more chapter, chapter 12. I'm going to charge this a little bit more so it doesn't crap out on us. All right, chapter 12. Now these are the kings of the land which the children of Israel smote and possessed their land on the other side Jordan toward the rising of the sun. Toward the rising of the sun, from the river Arnon unto Mount Hermon, and all the plain on the east. So what's going to follow now is just a recitation of all the different kings and cities overthrown by the Israelites. Verse 2. Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon and ruled from Aroer, which is upon the bank of the river Arnon, and from the middle of the river, and from half Gilead, even unto the river Jabbok, which is the border of the children of Ammon. And from the plain to the sea of Chinneroth of the east, and unto the sea of the plain, even the salt sea on the east, the way to Beth Jeshimoth, and from the south under Ashdoth Pisgah, and the coast of Og, king of Bashan, which was of the remnant of the giants that dwelt at Ashtaroth and at Edrei, and reigned in Mount Hermon and in Salcah, and in all Bashan, unto the border of the Geshurites and the Maacathites, and half Gilead, the border of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Then did Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the children of Israel smite. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it for a possession unto the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe of Manasseh. So these are all the battles that took place before they even entered the promised land. Verse 7, and these are the kings of the country which Joshua and the children of Israel smote on this side Jordan on the west, from Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, even unto the Mount Halak, which goeth up to Seir, which Joshua gave unto the tribes of Israel for a possession according to their divisions. In the mountains and in the valleys and in the plains and in the springs and in the wilderness and in the south country, the Hittites, the Amorites, and the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The king of Jericho, 1. The king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, 1. The king of Jerusalem, 1. The king of Hebron, 1. The king of Jarmuth, 1. Every time I'm saying 1, it's O-N-E. The king of Lachish, 1. The king of Eglon, 1. The king of Gezer, 1. The king of Debir, 1. The king of Geder, 1. The king of Hormah, 1. The king of Arad, 1. The king of Libnah, 1. The king of Adullam, 1. The king of Makkedah, 1. The king of Bethel, 1. The king of Tapua, 1. The king of Hepher, 1. The king of Ephek, 1. The king of Lasharon, 1. The king of Madon, 1. The king of Hazor, 1. The king of Shimron-Meron, 1. Shimron-Meron, I like that. The king of Achshaph, 1. The king of Ta'anak, 1. The king of Megiddo, 1. The king of Kedesh, 1. The king of Jokneam of Carmel, 1. The king of Dor in the east of Dor, and the coast of Dor, 1. The king of the nations of Gilgal, 1. The king of Tirzah, 1. All the kings, 30 and 1. Thus ends chapter 12. All right, so this is the conquests of Israel under Moses in verses 1 through 6, and then under Joshua in verses 7 through 24. When it talks about the plain on the east, that's on the east of Jordan, called the plain. So that was just in verse 1. Now these are the kings of the land which the children of Israel smote and possessed their land on the other side Jordan toward the rising of the sun. So, something to know about the Hebrew way of being in the world. We Westerners, on every map, we have north, the cardinal direction north at the top of the map. And of those four directions, north, east, south, west, we understand north to be the primary direction that we're oriented towards. For Hebrews, in their mind's eye, the direction forward was always east. Right was always south. Left was always north. Behind was always west. So they were oriented towards the east, towards the sun. So, that's just something to know as you're going through this. I'm sure I'm going to find it important to bring up sometime later, but they're just oriented differently in the world than we are. So they have their own calendar. They follow a lunar calendar, not a solar calendar. They're oriented towards the east, not the north. There are a number of things like that that don't feel consequential, but when you understand them and you look at the biblical language, you start to see that these people saw themselves living very differently on a daily basis than perhaps we do. Verse 2, it talks about the middle of the river, quote, Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon and ruled over Aroer, which is upon the bank of the river Arnon, and from the middle of the river, and from half Gilead, even unto the river Jabbok. It is not unusual, even among us, for a river to be divided between two lords, and for their territories or jurisdictions to meet in the middle of the river. And besides, here is a very particular reason for this expression, because the city Ar, which was no part of Sihon's dominions, but belonged to the Moabites, according to Deuteronomy chapter 2, was in the middle of the river Arnon. And therefore the middle of the river is properly here mentioned as the bound of Sihon's dominion on that side. It also said that he owned half of Gilead in Hebrew, and the half Gilead, that is, half of the country of Gilead. This doth not denote the bound from which his dominion began, but the country over which his dominion was, which began at Arnon, and took in half Gilead, and ended at Jabbok, beyond which was the other half of Gilead, which belonged to Og. In verse 3, it talks about on the east, quote, and from the plain to the sea of Chinneroth on the east, and unto the sea of the plain, even the salt sea. So when it says on the east, which words describe the situation not of the sea of Chinneroth, which was part of the western border of Sihon's dominion, but of the plain, which is here said to lie eastward from the sea of Chinneroth, and also eastward from the salt sea. And this was indeed the situation of the plains of Moab, which are here spoken of. They lay between the two seas, that of Chinneroth and the salt sea, and eastward to them both. Sea of the plain. Oh yeah, it talks about the sea of the plain. The salt sea was a famous plain, pleasant and fruitful, before it was turned into a sea. Is that true? Well, I might look into it later. In verse 4, it makes reference to Ashtaroth and Edrei, quote, and the coast of Og, king of Bashan, which was at the remnant of the giants that dwelt in Ashtaroth and Edrei. Sometimes at the one, sometimes at the other city, both being his royal mansions. But Israel made one grave serve him, who could not be contented with one place, one palace. So he went back and forth between the cities of Ashtaroth and Edrei, because he couldn't be satisfied in one place. And then JW says, well, they found a place for him, just one place for him to stay forever, and that was his grave. That was nice of them. Verse 6 talks about smiling. Quote, them did Moses, the servant of the Lord, and the children of Israel smite. Not smile, smite. And the Lord, the servant of the Lord, gave it for a possession. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave it for a possession unto the Reubenites and the Gadites and the half-tribe. Ooh, God bless this guy, whoever it was that typed this out, because he's helping me grow in grace. When it says he smited, fresh mercies must not drown the remembrance of former mercies, nor must the glory of the present instruments of good to the church diminish the just honor of those that went before them. Joshua's services were confessedly great, but let not those under Moses be forgotten. Both together proclaim God to be the Alpha and Omega of his people's salvation. What does that have to do with smiting? Them did Moses, the servant, the Lord, and the children of Israel smite. I think the overall message of this is trying to give Moses his due. So I don't think he's picking on the word smite. I think JW is just commenting on this, that we're in Joshua now. We're meditating upon all the victories of Joshua. However, what Moses did was important and impressive as well. So we just need to give each their due. We humans were very short-sighted, and we pay attention to what's right in front of us, and we don't give proper proportion to history, those who came before, nor to what's coming. And that's why, time and time again, I actually haven't, I'm going to show you a book. I've used the concepts I got in this book several times. It's called Calendar, Christ's Time for the Church. It's by Lawrence Holstuki, who I don't agree with him theologically about a lot of things, but he lays out Christian understanding of time very well. And the two words that occupy opposite but connected concepts are anamnesis and prolepsis. Anamnesis is taking something from the past and making it real in the present. Prolepsis is taking something from the future and making it real in the present. So all of this history where God has shown his love for his people through his miraculous deeds and his providence, part of the reason we read the word in worship and need to know it as believers is to make that history our reality. God did those things for us, not just for them. But you also have prolepsis, the reality of the coming kingdom, the nature of that kingdom, a desire to be in that kingdom, and then having part of that kingdom through the church, through the sacraments, the kingdom breaking in among us. So when it's talking about Moses here, that's a call to an appreciation of what came before, anamnesis, making the reality of Moses present among us. But there also has to be a call among the faithful to have an appreciation for the future that's coming. So that's why Christians in the Lord's Prayer, which we've been saying for almost 2,000 years, have said, thy kingdom come. We want this future to come to us now in the present. I'll find many other opportunities to talk about that. So if you forget it, I will remind you. In verse 8, it talks about the wilderness, quote, in the mountains and in the valleys and in the plains and in the springs and in the wilderness and in the south country, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. This word here and elsewhere in Scripture, wilderness, midbar in Hebrew, notes not a land wholly desert and uninhabited, but one thin of inhabitants, as in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 34, and then it has a couple other references. The Girgashites either were now incorporated with some other of these nations, or as the tradition of the Jews is, upon the approach of Israel under Joshua, they all withdrew and went to Africa, leaving their land to be possessed by Israelites, with whom they saw it was fruitless to contend. I know nothing of the Girgashites, Gargashites. I have no idea who they are. Verse 23, the king of Gilgal is mentioned. The king of Dor in the coast of Dor, one. The king of the nations of Gilgal, one. Not of that Gilgal where Joshua first lodged after his passage over Jordan, where it doth not appear that there was either king or city, but of a city of the same name, probably in Galilee towards the sea, where diverse people might possibly resort for trade and merchandise, over whom this was a king, as formerly Tidal seems to have been in Genesis 14, verse 1. So, according to JW, this is another one of those instances of two the same name for two different places. And then finally, in verse 24, there's the number 31. The king of Tirzah won, all the kings 30-1. Each being king only of one city or small province belonging to it, which was by the wise and singular providence of God, that they might be more easily conquered. But what a fruitful land must Canaan then be, which could subsist so many kingdoms, and yet at this day it is one of the most barren and despicable countries in the world. Such is the effect of the curse it lies under, since its inhabitants rejected the Lord of glory. So this is something we encountered, I want to say we encountered in Deuteronomy, where JW commented on the fact that whenever the promised land was given to the Jews, as a kid I remember reading it was a lush land flowing with milk and honey, and going, man, these people's standards were really low, because I've seen footage of Israel and it's dry, dry, dry. What JW said several chapters ago, if not in the previous book, was, well, at the time that the land was given, it was lush. And there was plenty of rain and vegetation, and the land produced amply. But the reason that the land isn't that way now is because the Jews abandoned covenant faithfulness, and the Lord cursed the land because of them. And that was the threat. Yeah, I think his comment on that came in the midst of the tribes at Abel announcing God's curses. And I think that was one of the curses, that the Lord would curse the land. So I've been thinking about that and wondering, we, through modern archaeology, can figure out, we can do that kind of fossil record digging research to figure out what their environment was like 3,000 years ago at this time. And I really wonder if it shows a more lush and plentiful environment. So if I have enough time, I should look into that later. But something else he's talking about is the number of kings and kingdoms in that area. And I don't know what JW knew. Several years ago, I studied ancient Greek society around the time of, the great stories of, not just the Iliad and the Odyssey, but a lot of the legends around ancient Sparta and Athens, the Peloponnesian War, histories by Herodotus. And at that time, even though there was an established Greek culture, and one could say that the Persian Empire did war against Greece or the Greeks, they really weren't a cohesive country. Rather, each individual, they called them city-states. Polis, Polis, was a city-state. And that seems to have been the similar case here, where, like Sparta was a city that had some other towns around it that belonged to it. But there was two kings, actually, of Sparta. It was kind of a weird place. But each city had its own government, had its own officials, had its own royalty. And then they extended influence to other cities around them that weren't as strong. And then they would actually go out and also have colonies that they went. Really interesting place in history. The reason I bring that up is because we think of ancient history as like a lot of empires akin to our nation states today that are competing for land, when actually empires were rare in the ancient world. And what was much more common was self-contained, self-governing units around central cities. And so, today we have these huge, vast countries all under one government. That's not how the ancient world worked. Even when these huge empires expanded, they usually didn't last very long, and they collapsed because the task of governing such a large area is just so difficult. So to JW, it just seems like a remarkable thing that there were this many kings. Historically, I don't think it's that remarkable. I think that was probably the norm in areas like this prior to the great empires doing what they did. And then, of course, that becomes the story of Israel, subject to one empire and then another until the modern state of Israel. So that's a whole other thing. We'll talk about the modern state of Israel some other time. But we've covered some good ground. That last chapter was super boring, but we talked about some good stuff with it. So hope you feel a little bit smarter and like your time was well spent. I'll be doing this again this evening at 5:30, so feel free to join me then. Okay, bye.